Let's talk about the Day of the Dead. Now, of the three trilogy, I think in some ways this is my favorite. I don't think it's the best of the three. Night of the Living Dead is clearly the superior film of the three. It shows George A. Romero at his most creative, especially with a tiny budget. And you can see with Dawn of the Dead that when you are given this giant budget, a lot of times you don't make as great of work because you're not challenged in the same way. And I do think that happens a lot in Dawn of the Dead, where everything's kind of just bigger for the sake of being bigger, much like in Mad Max 2, how it's really not that different from the first one, although in some ways it's really different than the first one. But it's basically just the idea is just a bigger budget mostly. And the difference between Day of the Dead and Dawn of the Dead is I think Dawn of the Dead struggled with tone, where Day of the Dead had a much more focused tone. When we open up on this movie, it's of course again with a helicopter, which is something George A. Romero seems to really enjoy, and calling people flyboy for some reason. And so you get a real idea of who these characters are really quickly, which is really fascinating way to do it. Because instead of kind of showing us each character and then kind of going into their backstory, Romero gives us just the scene where they're all in the helicopter, and immediately within 4 lines, you know exactly who everyone is, what their motives are, how they feel about this situation, and it's very open, which is sometimes hard, especially in Romero's films. There are a lot of they're in a lot of closed off spaces. They're often in a closed off space, and it's interesting that the opening scene is in a helicopter because that's simultaneously the most open of spaces, right? You have all of the air, but then it's also very confined space because they're all trapped in this helicopter. And they go to this city, and again, you can kind of see just how the budget of this film has even grown from the last film. And one of the things I find interesting about each of these films is they're so up the moment. The film that came out in 1968 is a film of the 80s. It feels a film of the 60s. It feels very much like your cultural revolution. Likewise, the film that came out, Dawn of the Dead, that came out in the 70s, it feels also very 70s. And this film, which came out in the 80s, feels very 80s. They seem to have captured moments in history and similarly kind of just use zombies as basically a MacGuffin of sorts to actually talk about a lot of real issues. And I think they did that a ton in Night of the Living Dead, of course, having a black character as one of your main characters and a protagonist at that. And in the second film, a lot with materialism and capitalism. And with this film, they do a similar thing, but it has more to do with humanity and what it means to be alive. And what I was really happy about this film, especially at the beginning, is there's actually open spaces. They're not all closed off. And you get to see this whole city that's just zombies. And it's showing that no one's really left. This is it. As my friend Andrew was pointing out the other day, the first film is the start of the zombie apocalypse, the second film is in the middle of the apocalypse, and the third film is really at the end of it. This trilogy shows the different times, even though it really takes place probably over a couple of years maybe between the first film and the last film, although you can see between the first film and second film, it might only be a couple of days. And second film, third film, you could probably argue it's not that long either. Another thing that I think is interesting when you talk about the trilogy as a whole, which I feel like I'm going to be spending a lot of my time talking about the whole trilogy, is that each part focuses on a different part of America. It really takes on the 3 different types of America. The first film seems to take on the rural life of your average Americans, especially the conflict between whites and blacks. The second film seems much more concerned with suburbia, with malls, with kind of the middle America in the much more traditional sense, what most of America actually looks like, the suburbs, I suppose you would call them. And then the third film seems much more concerned with cities. And even though the third film doesn't actually take place in a city, it functions like a city, much like the second one functions like a household, much like the first one functions like a farm of sorts, if you think about it in that sort of hierarchical terms, and just the amount of people per film, right? In your first film, you have very few people, and that's, of course, partly a budget thing. Second film, you have a lot more people. And in the third film, you have even more people, not just zombies, but actual characters to learn and sort of care or not care about. And for some reason, The Day of the Dead is often seen as the film least liked. It's the one people often are just like, oh, that film's not that good. For me personally, I think it's a really strong film. I think there's a lot of good reasons for that. When they get back from the city, finding absolutely no one, they go into this military base, which by this point, I'm wondering why it took 3 films before they kind of had those. Like, you would think those are kind of regular kind of hideouts, but I guess George R. Romero just never really got around to it. So he finally gets around to it in this third film. And then you have the helicopter, and immediately there's conflict. He's like, we gotta fill this helicopter with gas. And they're like, oh, we'll do it later. We gotta go, because there's these it's like fenced off, but there's these zombies. And then they go underground. And for the next most of the film, really, they're underground, which I think is really interesting, especially with this kind of horrible kind of, I almost think of Joe versus the volcano kind of lights. And you really see them descend from humanity, even though as a group, the 4 of them maybe make fun of each other or kind of joke around, they seem to care a lot for each other. But when they go underground, and of course for the first time you see the military, and this is again how the 3 different parts of the trilogy exist. If the first film is about civilians, the second film is about reporters, and then the third film is about the military. And you see how differently they experience and try to triumph over. The first film, they're merely trying to survive, which I suppose they fail at. The second film, they're asking themselves, what do we do after we survive? How do we not only survive, but live past that? Which is a very real and a very honest question to ask. And I suppose, do they really answer that question? I don't know, maybe. And then in the third film, I think the big question here is, we have lived, we have quote unquote thrived, we have food, we have water, we have shelter, we have people to surround us. What do we do then? What do we do once we have, once we've met these hierarchical needs? How do we have a future? If, I suppose, the first film is about the past, what already happened. The second film is about the present, what's happening now. The third film is about the future. It's about what's going to happen after today, this week, this month, this year. They're trying to solve, and they're exploring the humanity of these creatures. And they bring a lot of interesting kind of folks and different ideas on how they do that. And of course you see the military versus the scientists, right? And what's interesting is, up to this point, there's always been the argument between the logical people and the people who are fighting on emotions or faith or what have you. It's always been, we have to be logical, we have to be logical about this. And then on the other hand, people being, no, this is our family, this is our friends, we can't kill them. But in this film, what's interesting is everyone along the spectrum is logical. These are all people thinking logically. And yet, even though they're all thinking logically, you really have 2 different ideals. You have the ideals of the military, which is just to kill every one of them and just slaughter all the zombies, which would be to kill most living things on Earth. And then you have the scientists who are looking for a solution, either to solve it before it happens so you don't turn into a zombie, or to fix the zombies themselves, or as Dr. Frankenstein, as he is called in the film so often, is to train them, to domesticate them of sorts, to humanize them. And they're all searching, and the scientists are all looking for ways to humanize these creatures, while the military says there is no humanizing them. They are not human, they are not like human, they are a different species. And this is where your sort of main conflict becomes in. And I love the female protagonist in that opening scene where she is sitting in that amazing room. And it's interesting how much of this film is caught up in dreams. And it's something I want to jump to when we get to the end. But the opening scene, it opens on a dream, which is very different from the other 2 films. And this awesome dream at that, where she walks up to the calendar and all of those hands come out and grab her. Of course, reminiscent of the first film when the blonde woman is grabbed and taken out. And it's something very similar in this film. And I love this loneliness and isolation of this film. And again, much like the second film, she is the only woman in the film, and how she deals with basically all men, which is interesting. I don't know why. I guess it's because it's a military program. I'm not really sure, but she is the only woman, and she searches for love with a character whose name I cannot seem to remember. Not that I can ever remember any character's name. And you can see him really struggling with PTSD, and I think this is the first film where they really struggle not only with the fear, which in the first film, of course, they just don't have time, because that all takes place over one night. In the second film, they never really get to, but in the third film, that is a big exploration of the film, which is what it is fear. What do you do when you are constantly living in fear? How do you survive? How do you have a future when all you can think about is your absolute terror of not only being killed, but having to constantly kill these things? And in this film, of course, they have to interact closely with them because they're trying to train them, they're trying to domesticate them, which I think they do some really interesting, like the idea of kind of attaching collars onto them and having the hooks. Although you have to wonder, how the heck did they get the collars on in the first place? But I suppose that's just something you sort of have to buy into, and I'm just willing to buy into it because I'm not really sure how they would have got the collar on in the first place, or if they even show that. I'm not really sure how that system works, but I do love that they kind of live in this sort of mind silo, and they've built this whole system. And it's clear that they're functioning in many ways like a military. They're functioning like an army. They have these set of rules in place, these certain ideas in place of how they move forward and how they do this, that, and the other. And of course, you see their, right, where they live, where they eat. It's very military, it's very organized, everything has its exact place, even though, and of course this is the great irony of so many films about the military, and I think one of Romero's great points is organization, logic, so to speak, doesn't mean the lack of tyranny, or tyranny that is perhaps insanity also. I mean, the leader of the new military, right, the new leader of the military, once the major dies, which he dies before we ever actually get into the film, he is clearly an insane person, and yet even though he is insane and is perhaps descending into some psychosis, it's all under this guise of organization. And I think Romero's talking a lot about the military, about armies, about how we often create this guise of justice to hide the horror, much like in how the Dawn of the Dead, you see the police officers just slaughtering people at the beginning of the film. I think you see a similar thing in this film, where you see people using the guise of authority, or in this case the military, to sort of hide from the truth, sort of to hide behind, as you so often see with police officers who will murder people and then hide behind, well, I was doing my job, I was just doing my job. Same thing the Nazis said, and it's the same thing these military people are saying, is that, well, we're just doing what we can. And of course, this is kind of the main conflict of the film, and I love the idea of the woman giving her partner, what have you, a sedative to sort of calm him down, and then he, of course, fights against the sedative, but then when he realizes that she's going through the same thing, and everyone's going through the same thing, he's incredibly pissed off, which of course he would be, because if we're all just taking sedatives, we constantly have to be. It reminds me of the character who works with the radios, who's drinking the whole film. They're like, you're just always drunk. And he's like, yeah, of course I'm always drunk. We're in an apocalypse. What else would I be? What else is there to live for? And it's interesting that so many of these military figures sort of find comfort in this arbitrary nature of organization, of leadership. You know, whoever is at the top of the list, you listen to him. And the moment that starts to back down, guns come out and people are aiming guns at each other. And just what a absolutely wonderful scene when they're at the meeting. It's like 7 o'clock. The woman's like, I'm not going to listen to this. And she stands up, and the leader says, if you do not sit down, you will be shot. And she's like, that's bullshit. And then instead of threatening to shoot himself, he tells someone under him to shoot her. And he thinks it's a joke, and he's like, bam. And he's like, no, I'm serious. And then he's kind of hesitant, and then the military leader pulls out his gun and threatens to kill his officer before he threatens to kill her. Because at this point, it's really not about killing her, it's about his need for control, his need for order. And I think something they do well in this film, and something they do well with the whole trilogy, is there are no evil characters. I mean, suppose the living dead are sort of evil, but the actual, all the characters within it, none of them are evil. I mean, some of them are kind of foolish or ignorant, but they all genuinely believe that they're doing the right thing. And at this moment, this military leader, although he is this terrible human being and you do not like him as a viewer, at least I didn't at all, you understand where he's coming from. You understand why his motives are the way they are. You understand why he thinks the way he does. Because what he believes the only way to survive is through order. He's a military man. He thinks that through this, he will control things. And of course, they do eventually get her to sit down. But I think it's interesting that when Dr. Frankenstein, as they call him, comes in, he is uncontrollable. And I think part of that has to do with his sincere lack of fear for death or the military at all. And he's the only one that's really able to kind of just do whatever he wants. And that goes on, and you kind of see some of the doctor's experiments, and this is the first time they kind of explain what is going on with the zombies. They're trying to almost build a sort of lore to this, and just the special effects through this whole film, although at this moment is at one of its best, is absolutely beautiful. I mean, you see entire rib cages opened up, you see people that are just brains, and for a film made in 1985, if this film was made today, it would win an Oscar for special effects. And the fact that it didn't win an Oscar for special effects back then, I don't believe, just baffles my mind, because the special effects are far and beyond anything I have ever seen. I genuinely felt like I was seeing zombies, and especially later in the film when you see people being ripped apart, it's just absolutely incredible. Or when they rip someone's head off and their mouth is still moving or their eyes are moving, it's some of the most incredible special effects I have ever seen. And again, if this film was made today, I think it would still win an Oscar for special effects. That's how incredible these practical effects are. And they never at any time rely on, computerized effects, which of course in the 80s you did not have as much leeway as you do today. But even then, it's absolutely amazing. And I was genuinely astounded by the whole thing. And so they meet with Dr. Frankenstein, and he's trying to explain, he's trying to understand. Like, that's all he wants to do. He keeps saying, I just want to understand, I just want to understand. Once we understand, then everything will be okay. And what the anthropologist is pointing out, she says, we don't have time to understand. We don't have time to sit around and theorize. We need to have a solution. That's what we need. And he is so obsessed with understanding that he begins to lose himself. And so she goes off to meet with a helicopter pilot and the man who runs the radio. Now, what's interesting about these two characters, and it's something Romero likes to explore in this film, is that they are sort of the Switzerland. Now, always they side with the scientists, but they really have no part in this game. They're not military, they're not scientists. They're basically there to do a job. And the anthropologist, she points that out. She says, you guys really don't have a reason to be here. Like, you don't care about any of this. You have no care of any of, about any of this stuff, about the future of our world. What the pilot points out again and again, he says, in an amazing Jamaican accent. I think it's interesting that they, in all three films, or at least the second and third, I don't know if they do in the first, they reference not only Jamaica, but the religion, which is where, not voodoo, that's what Americans call it, but there's an actual religion under that practice in Jamaica and many of the West Indies. And it's interesting that they can nod to that, because that's where zombies, right? That's where the idea of zombies come from. Of course, it's much more complicated than how they make it in the film, but more or less, I think that's a sort of interesting thing. And the pilot's whole thing is he says, look, if I could fly to an island right now, I would. Like, I don't think there's a reason to try to fight for humanity, which is this anthropologist's whole idea. Is she wants to make the world a better place. She wants to fix things. She wants things to go back to normal. And what him and the man who runs the radio both understood is there is no going back. I think in both the last films, really, there's this hope that everything will go back to normal. You can see in the first film, The Night of the Living Dead, especially between the husband and wife couple, once everything will go back to normal, everything will go back to normal, everything will go back to normal. And then in the second film, right, they're creating this facade of normalcy through their apartment and the clothes and the fancy watches and all that. And in the third film, you see the characters for the first time realizing that there is no normal. There is no going back. This is it. This is all there is. And that's, at that point in the film, something she just cannot accept. And then we hear kind of the crazy ravings of Dr. Frankenstein, which if you didn't think he was insane up to this point, you're like, oh yeah, he's clearly insane. And it's a bit confusing, and it's one of the things they love about George A. Romero is, unlike James Cameron, he never tries to hold your hand. He never tries to explain anything to you. He just says, here are the things, figure it out on your own. And so you can't tell at this point when you're listening to the recording, is Dr. Frankenstein insane or is he just really smart? It's really hard to tell at this point. And they go and they see Bub, who is this zombie that he's basically domesticated, and it's absolutely so intriguing. And you see him becoming human, basically, and it's not human in kind of the warm bodies way, and where like less flesh is rotting and all that. It's more of in his actions, right? The way he moves about, the way he'll listen to things, and the way he'll learn. And they actually talk about learning at the beginning of the film, when they tried to call and get new zombies to test on. They said, oh, they're not coming as fast. There's not as many coming. And the anthropologist says they're learning, which is just an awesome, just kind of foreshadowing, which I think this film has a ton of. And you see Bub, as they call him, and you see him grow, and you see him learn, and you see the relationship between Bub and Dr. Frankenstein, which really is to me, seems to be a relationship between, of course, not a coincidence, between Dr. Frankenstein and his monster. It has a very similar feel to it. It's someone, although unlike Dr. Frankenstein, who loves his creation, who believes his creation can be human, which, of course, is the inverse of Dr. Frankenstein, who believed that his creation was this horrible, terrible thing, and spends most of the book trying to actually kill Frankenstein, which is, or Frankenstein's monster, I should say. Which isn't great, but in this film, he loves him. And of course, the military hate him, and there's the pointing of guns, which is just another awesome scene, because you see the zombie pull the trigger, showing that he knows how to shoot a gun. But I was almost wondering if maybe, they took all the bullets out, but what if there's a bullet left in the chamber? And there's enough suspense that you kind of wonder that. But what if there is bullets in there? And of course there's not. It's just a fascinating scene, a fascinating moment of where you see someone who clearly has a gun and can very easily shoot it, and someone who is completely incapable, and yet you don't know who's going to win at that moment. The odds in many ways are evened out, which is strange when you're talking about one zombie versus a guy with 10 guns strapped to him, who, by the way, always has so many guns strapped to him, which is just another amazing detail of his character. And just the costume designs in general are kind of awesome. And then, of course, there is the tragic scene where they're getting more zombies, which this is going to happen eventually. They try and capture more zombies, and a couple of them are bitten. And one of them that is bitten is the anthropologist's partner. Now, of course, after being bitten, this guy's running around. He's like, I don't want to become a zombie. That's kind of sucks. And the woman chases after him, knocks him in the head with a rock, which, how does that not have some sort of brain damage? And then just right there cuts off his arm, which is just so badass. Let's be honest, that is just the most badass thing a person can do. Just cuts his arm off right there, lights a torch on fire, and just, lights his whole freaking arm on, or what's left of his arm, immediately, which is just insane. And then they put him inside, and of course there's a fight that, hey, we need to kill him because he's going to turn into a zombie. And this real terror of turning into a zombie, this terror of becoming something else. Often when they're bitten, they say, please shoot me, kill me, I don't want to become that, I never want to become that. And you'll see that they'll kill them as a sort of mercy, and they're saying, hey, we need to kill him because of mercy. And she's like, no, we can't kill him. But that's when everything sort of falls off the rails, because they realize that Dr. Frankenstein has gone a little too insane, and they realize that Dr. Frankenstein has been feeding and he's been saying this the whole film, which is another incredible foreshadowing. He says, they need reward, they need reward, they need reward. And you're like, what the heck is he rewarding his zombies with? Because they talk about trying to give them these meat packs, which zombies do not care for at all. And you realize that he has dug up the graves of all of the dead military man, and is feeding them to the zombies. And the other question that I don't know if it's really resolved or not is, has Dr. Frankenstein been murdering them? Which he may very well be murdering them, because he's kind of insane, and it's kind of hinted that the way the Major died is not very clear, nor any of the other deaths. So I understand at that moment why they murder Dr. Frankenstein. But I mean, look, if I was the leader of the military, probably not the best idea to murder the one guy who can, you know, solve this whole zombie problem. But I get it. He just saw his friends literally being fed to by a doctor, so I understand why they kill him. And that, of course, leads to everyone running around just absolutely terrored because now the military men are just gonna murder everyone, which understand why they would want to do that. And so they bring everyone back to where like the mining shaft is, where all the zombies are, and they trap the radio guy and the anthropologist into that, which is strange because like they're the reason they do it is because they're telling the pilot, you have to take us, right, you have to fly us, and he's like, I'm never gonna do that, and he's like, okay, well then we'll release them into that, and he's like, no, wait, I'll fly you, I'll do whatever you want, just let's go, just let them go. And then this asshole is like, no, I'm gonna put him in the silo anyways, which is just kind of a stupid idea, and they're like, oh, we'll beat it out of him. No, that was really stupid. If you really wanted to get out of there alive, you wouldn't have done that. You would have kept them as prisoners, gone onto your plane, and then had them fly out. Because he definitely would have, but he's just a terrible human being who is not very good about thinking about the future. And I guess, again, in the moment, he's pretty angry. He's seeing his friends being literally eaten. So I guess you give him a little bit of slack there. And then, of course, there's the final scene, or set of scenes, when the guy with now one arm goes up, releases all the zombies, and is eaten and has all the zombies come back down, which is just really badass and kind of awful. But good for him, I guess. I mean, I guess it works, sort of. I'm not really sure entirely the logic of it, other than, like, he's just really pissed. So I guess it works, sort of. Fine. And then just the absolute incredible special effects when they start eating all of these people alive. And you can see, like, individually, they give them their own individual kill. You see them running around their own way, and it's very what their character does and how the character reacts. And you can see that the military leader only cares about himself and immediately abandons everyone else. And you can see them kind of dying off and eating all of these incredible and strange and unique ways. And then, of course, this is happening simultaneously while the radio person and anthropologist are running to find the silo, and of course the pilot goes in after them, shooting zombies left and right. It's pretty awesome. And then you have the final comeuppance, which is Bub, the domesticated zombie, kills the military leader, which is just so satisfying. And I love the idea of Bub kind of finding his humanity, and I think his humanity doesn't come from listening to music or reading a book or remembering something. I think his humanity comes really from the death of his friend and finding love in a familial way, at least, and friendship with this doctor. And when he sees its death, that sort of revenge is the most human thing he could do, because at that moment he is not a zombie, because he's not killing to eat. And as they say, they eat merely out of instinct. They don't eat because they're actually hungry. They don't need stomachs. They just eat for instinct. This zombie doesn't kill the military leader for any other reason than he killed his friend. And I think that's a really awesome way. I mean, I think the way that he kind of kills him, like the way that the zombie's able to shoot him, is a little silly. Like, the guy, why didn't he load his gun before he ran the corner? But I guess, being chased by zombies, so probably isn't thinking that far ahead. So I guess it's fair. But it is a lovely ending for that character. And the fact that the pilot, the radio person, and the anthropologist all jump onto the helicopter is great. But then, yeah, I'm going back to the very beginning. The very opening starts with a dream. And at that moment, the anthropologist gets into the helicopter, and inside the helicopter, there's a zombie. And he goes, roar! And then smash cut, she wakes up on a beach. Now, I can't help but wonder, and I know this is intentional, is she alive at the end of the film? Because to wake up from it, right, to go from that to wake up from a dream, you really have to wonder. And so it seems on the surface like a happy ending. But it could be that they're all dead, which is a much less happy ending. But overall, I'd say I'd give this film a 7 out of 10. I think it's better than Dawn of the Dead. I still don't think it's as good as Night of the Living Dead. But honestly, it's a really enjoyable film, and you should really give it a watch.